Wow. When you share sources like this with us, uh, it's really something else. We're talking about Hinduism, and it's really hitting me just how ancient and influential it is. And the material that you sent, hinting at these Vedas and Upanishads, it really gives you that sense of deep roots. You know what I mean? Like deep roots in human thought and spirituality.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that sense of continuity, These aren't just some old dusty books. We're talking about a living tradition that has shaped and still shapes, a huge part of the world. And it's like your sources really underscore that enduring relevance.
Exactly. And, for this deep dive, we're not just going to, like sit here and just recite historical facts, right? We're going on a mission here. Our mission is to really try to understand, based on the sources that you've provided, the historical foundations of Hinduism, like how did it all begin? And then its importance, the human story, it's a big one. And to make sense of these really important religious texts, the Vedas and the Upanishads, right, without getting lost in a million little details.
Right. We want those big aha moments.
Yeah, exactly. We're here to connect the dots for you,
Yeah.
to create some aha moments, hopefully. And I think it's really important to remember that, the sources you've shared with us, they offer like a multifaceted view, right? Including perspectives from both Western scholarship and also those traditional Indian interpretations. And I think that's so cool because it gives us a much richer, though sometimes more nuanced understanding of this very ancient tradition, right?
It's not just one side of the story.
Yeah. Okay. So let's journey back to the very beginnings, like way back. Okay.
Yeah.
One of the first things that really stood out to me in your sources was this idea that, India's religious history, it didn't just like pop out of nowhere with the Vedas, fully formed.
Yeah.
There's this mention of a shared like Indo-Iranian period. And that's so interesting.
Oh, yeah. That's really key because if we connect this to those broader movements of early humans, right, how populations moved around and how ideas were exchanged, it really highlights how religious development rarely happens in isolation. You know what I mean? It's like this cross-pollination, and the sources suggest a common ancestral heritage with ancient Iran, before these traditions branched out and evolved in their own distinct ways and became what we now recognize as Hinduism and all the other traditions that came from that Indo-Iranian period.
All right. Like a branching out.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. Okay. And while the Vedas are, undeniably ancient, like no one's arguing that figuring out the exact date seems like it's a bit of a tricky business. I noticed the sources, they point out that the manuscripts that we have today are actually relatively recent.
Yeah, precisely. And what's so remarkable about that is the reliance on oral tradition that your sources emphasize. It wasn't initially written down. They were like, one source puts these beautiful winged words, passed down through generations just by memorization, and recitation and that meticulous process of copying and recopying that your material mentions becomes incredibly significant in understanding how these texts survived, for thousands of years in the challenging Indian climate.
Oh my gosh, it really makes you think about that level of commitment to preserving knowledge.
Right.
Right. Like without, the things we have today, the printing press, the internet, all that stuff. And it wasn't even a matter of just referring to certain books. Like set books, the sources discuss early terms like Burkle, Yajnaski, Samchinai, Atka Roa, Fijirasalka. It's like these weren't titles of books, but more about the style or form of the verses, right?
Exactly. Like think of them as different poetic styles or liturgical forms instead of, fixed collections of texts. It gives us a glimpse into that more fluid and evolving nature of these early religious expressions. It wasn't so rigid back then.
It's like a different way of thinking about transmitting knowledge and preserving it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, now one of the sources makes a really interesting statement. I thought it was pretty bold. It suggests that Hindu religion is like uniquely native compared to some of the other major world religions.
Right.
And partly it says because of India's geographical isolation and what it calls its insular secular history. That's a pretty big claim.
Yeah, well, it really raises a fundamental question about, how geography and historical context shape religious development.
Sure.
And the argument presented in your source suggests that, India's relative isolation allowed for a more unbroken internal evolution of religious thought, where key ideas they developed organically within the subcontinent with these traceable links across time.
That's a fascinating perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's actually get into the texts themselves now. The Rig Veda, one seems to get a lot of attention, often hailed as the oldest layer of Vedic literature and even considered, the true and only Veda by some early European scholars, according to our sources. But I think it's really crucial to understand that its primary nature, it's a collection of hymns for sacrifices.
That's a vital distinction, It has this immense historical and religious weight, But understanding its original function as a liturgical text that was used in rituals is really key. It wasn't initially like a book of philosophical doctrines in the way we might think of, later religious texts. So the key takeaway here isn't just its age, it's that early religious life was really deeply intertwined with ritual practice.
So it's not just what it says, but how it was used.
Exactly.
Okay, trying to understand. Oh my gosh, it sounds like navigating a linguistic maze.
Yeah.
The sources mention this archaic language words that have completely shifted in meaning over centuries, core terms with multiple potential interpretations. It's no wonder there have been so many different attempts to try and make sense of it.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the acknowledgement of these interpretative hurdles. Your source points to three main approaches: the fragmented interpretations we find in those later Brahmanas and Upanishads, then there's Sayana's comprehensive traditional commentary from way back in the medieval period, and then all the various schools of modern European scholarship. And the fact that all three often arrive at what your source calls incoherent sense in certain places is really significant. It suggests that the Rig Veda might be way more complex and layered than just a simple book of prayers.
Yeah, there's a lot more going on.
Yeah.
It sounds like the hymns themselves already assume this whole complex system of rituals and priestly roles are in place already.
Precisely, the poetic expressions of the Rig Veda, as one of your sources notes, are really deeply embedded within these established ritualistic practices. And as time went on, the Yajurveda represents a significant expansion of this ritualism to the point where the original intention of praising the gods gradually became secondary to just the intricate performance of the ceremonies themselves.
So the how becomes more important than the why, in a way.
In a way, yeah, the focus shifts.
Okay, so when we look at the actual content,
Yeah.
of these early Vedas, the worship of nature, that seems to be a central element. And one of the sources even compares it to, ancient Greek mythology.
Right, and the concept of arrested anthropomorphism that your source mentions is really insightful here. It suggests that while the Vedic deities were associated with these natural forces like the sky or fire, they weren't always conceived of as fully human-like figures in the earliest stages. Maybe less so than some of those later Greek gods.
Right, like they're connected to nature, but they're not fully personified.
Yeah, exactly.
But, trying to definitely pin down these nature gods like Varuna, Indra, the Ashvins, that seems to be another area where scholars disagree their exact origins and their primary roles aren't always so clear-cut.
And that inherent uncertainty, as one of your sources points out, it's just a natural consequence of trying to reconstruct ancient belief systems, those original attributes and functions that led to the personification of these natural forces. They can be difficult to fully disentangle from those later myths and characteristics that people started ascribing to them as things evolved.
Right, it's like trying to trace the roots back through all these layers of interpretation and myth-making and everything.
It's like a puzzle with some missing pieces.
Now, this concept of urda that comes up as this fundamental Aryan ethical idea, possibly even predating the ethical coloring of the gods themselves, it's described as the ruda of the cow, guided by the rorda.
It's beautiful imagery.
It is, but what does that actually signify?
Well, Urta can be understood as this cosmic order,
Yeah.
like the inherent truth and righteousness that governs the whole universe. The phrase Urta of the cow, guided by the Urta, could symbolize that natural life-sustaining order represented by the cow being directed and maintained by this fundamental principle of truth. And the sources suggest that the gods themselves were seen as born from or within this murda, upholding it and cherishing it. So the key takeaway here isn't just a concept of cosmic order, it's the idea that this order itself is the foundation upon which even the divine operates. It suggests a very structured and principled early worldview.
It's like this underlying law that even the deities have to adhere to.
Yeah, exactly. It's the ground rules of reality.
And the way they talk about sacrifice in these early hymns is also very poetic, like Agni the fire being the son of dawn.
Right, that emphasizes the interconnectedness of those natural phenomena and their significance within the Vedic worldview. The lighting of the fire Agni immediately following the appearance of dawn Oshas. It's given this symbolic and poetic connection, highlighting the wonder they found in the natural world.
And it makes it so much more relatable.
Yeah.
Like even today, we still feel that awe when we see the sunrise.
Yeah, it connects us to that ancient experience.
And then there are these Abrahams, which seem very specific. They're like these purely liturgical sets of invocations tied to particular rishi families.
Yeah.
They must have had this deep sense of tradition and lineage.
Yeah, your source emphasizes that solemn and familial significance of these hymns. Each of the major family collections within the Rig Veda usually includes its own Apra hymn,
Yeah.
suggesting a strong tradition of distinct ritualistic expressions that were passed down within different groups of seers, like family traditions.
It's like each family had their own special way of connecting with the divine.
Yeah, exactly.
But it wasn't all just nature and ritual rite. The sources indicate that there was a kind of evolution in Vedic thought in the later parts of the Rig Veda and in the texts that followed.
Absolutely. We start to see a shift toward questioning the very nature of the divine. Even asking, as one hymn does, to which god shall we offer our oblation? This suggests a move beyond simply personifying natural forces and towards exploring more abstract and fundamental questions about existence itself.
It's like they're starting to think outside the box of the traditional gods.
Yeah, they're pushing the boundaries of their understanding.
And the creation hymn in the 10th book of the Rig Veda sounds especially important for people who study Sanskrit. It explores this fundamental principle in a pretty impersonal way.
Right. What's fascinating is this attempt to grapple with the origin of the universe in a way that goes beyond individual experience or those simple explanations. This hymn, as your source notes, delves into the concept of a primordial principle without necessarily assigning a personal identity to it. And that showcases a remarkable level of abstract thought for that period.
It's like an early form of cosmology and philosophy all rolled into one.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing when you think about it.
And it seems like this paved the way for more monotheistic ideas to emerge, with figures like Brihaspati gaining prominence as this father of the gods and the upholder of the earth.
That's a key step in the evolution of thought.
Yeah.
The idea of a singular, overarching divine being or principle starts to become more defined in these later Vedic developments.
Okay, so that leads us to the Upanishads, which are described as the culmination of the Vedic tradition. And the focus here seems to shift pretty dramatically towards this concept of salvation.
Yes, the Upanishads represent a significant transition within that Vedic lineage, while still rooted in the earlier Vedic texts. Their primary concern becomes the nature of ultimate reality, the individual self, and that path to liberation or moksha. It's a move towards inner inquiry.
It's like they're shifting from the outer world to the inner world. And they introduce some really core concepts that are still central to Hinduism today, like the belief in transmigration or reincarnation. And the sources suggest this might be connected to a somewhat pessimistic view of the cycle of life.
Yeah.
That constant birth, death, rebirth.
Yeah, the idea of a cyclical existence where beings are, repeatedly born, live, and die is a prominent theme in the Upanishads. And that potential for a pessimistic outlook arises from the perception of this cycle as inherently marked by suffering and impermanence, leading to the desire for release from it, as the ultimate goal.
Like escaping that cycle of suffering.
Exactly.
Then there's Brahma, spelled a little differently than the deity Brahma, representing the one, the universal, and the true reality. And this feels like a further development of those earlier hints of monotheism that we were talking about.
Brahma, in the context of the Upanishads, and it's important to distinguish this from the later masculine deity. Brahma, in the Hindu Trinity, represents the ultimate, all-encompassing ground of existence. Think of it like the underlying code that runs all the different programs on a computer. It's that fundamental reality that everything else is built upon.
It's like the source code of the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
And the ultimate aim is to achieve release moksha from this cycle of rebirth by realizing one's union with Brahma. And the sources mention that this involves letting go of desires and actions, which sounds like a really big undertaking.
It is a profound transformation. The Upanishads advocate for a transcendence of the ego and the cessation of those desires and actions that perpetuate the cycle of rebirth. Union with Brahma is achieved through this process of self-realization and detachment. It's a deep inner journey.
It's a whole different way of thinking about the self and the world.
For sure.
But the nature of Upanishadic thought itself is described as non-systematic, tentative, fanciful, and sometimes conflicting. It doesn't sound like a neatly packaged set of doctrines.
That's a very accurate description. The Upanishads are more like a collection of philosophical dialogues, meditations, and insightful explorations rather than this coherent, unified system of thought. They delve into various ideas about reality and the self, sometimes presenting different, even seemingly contradictory perspectives.
It's like a conversation that's still ongoing.
Yeah, it's an invitation to explore and inquire.
Now, two key concepts that emerge are Atman and Brahmanatman, being the individual self or breath, and its fundamental connection to Brahman, this ultimate reality. And the powerful statements, Tat Tvamasi, thou art that, and Aham Brahma Asmi, I am Brahma, are mentioned. These sound incredibly profound.
These are considered Mahavakyas, or great pronouncements within the Upanishadic tradition. Tat-tvamasi signifies the essential identity between the individual self, Atman, and the ultimate reality. Brahman and Brahma Asmi is the experiential realization of that identity. I am Brahman. These aren't just intellectual statements, they represent a profound spiritual awakening.
It's like a direct experience of that ultimate unity.
Exactly.
And the Upanishads seem to suggest that the perceived world, the reality we experience with our senses, might be nothing more than mere shadows cast by the one truth. That's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
This idea of Maya, often translated as illusion, suggests that the phenomenal world we perceive through our senses is not the ultimate reality, but rather a manifestation, a veil that obscures that underlying unity of Brahman. And it's a concept that has been debated and interpreted in many ways throughout Hindu philosophy.
It's like saying that what we see is just the surface.
Yeah.
There's a whole deeper reality beneath it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so it's interesting that even within these ancient traditions, there are hints of intellectual freedom and a spirit of questioning the sources. Mentioned later figures like Emperor Akbar and Raja Ramohun Roy, looking to the Upanishads for inspiration.
The Upanishads, despite their ancient origins, seem to have fostered this tradition of intellectual inquiry and a search for deeper meaning that resonated with these later thinkers and reformers who sought to bridge those different religious and philosophical traditions, you know? And the stories mentioned in your sources of a Brahmin seeking instruction from a king also suggests this broader engagement with higher religious thought beyond just the priestly class.
Like these texts were open to interpretation and reinterpretation across time.
Yeah, they invited dialogue and exploration.
And the evolution of Hindu thought also involves some of the older nature gods losing prominence over time, like Indra, whose significance diminished in later periods. It's like this religious landscape that was constantly being reshaped.
That highlights the dynamic nature of religious traditions. As those new philosophical and theological ideas gained traction, the roles and importance of earlier deities often shifted or reinterpreted within that evolving framework. You know, it's a living tradition.
Okay, so now one of your sources drawing on the perspective of Sri Aurobindo suggests that the Vedas might hold this much deeper psychological and spiritual meaning, beyond just those literal interpretations of ritual or nature.
Yeah.
And that adds this whole other dimension to how we understand them.
Yeah, this introduces a fascinating alternative way of understanding the Vedas. Instead of solely focusing on those external rituals or the worship of natural forces, this perspective explores the inner psychological and spiritual significance embedded within the Vedic hymns. It suggests the Vedas aren't just historical artifacts, they're also guides to inner transformation.
So it's like there's this whole hidden layer of meaning waiting to be uncovered.
Yeah, exactly.
It sounds like achieving certainty in interpreting these texts is a real challenge, though. The meaning of those key Vedic terms can be so fluid, leading to drastically different understandings. The example of vile man shifting from highest heaven to lowest hollow is pretty striking.
Yeah, that perfectly illustrates the inherent difficulty in interpreting such ancient languages and texts, where linguistic context and cultural understanding have evolved so significantly over time. And the lack of definitive keys means that multiple interpretations, sometimes vastly different, can be argued for, and that uncertainty underscores the value of considering, different lenses through which to view these texts.
It's like we need multiple perspectives to really grasp the depth of what's being said.
Yeah. Exactly.
And looking at the hymn to Agni, this alternative interpretation suggests that words like kavi, sir, kratu, will, or power, and shravas, revealed knowledge, can have these profound inner meanings, offering a much richer understanding of the hymn's purpose.
Exactly. By exploring those deeper psychological senses of the words, the hymn to Agni transcends being just an invocation to a sacrificial fire. It becomes a symbolic representation of the awakening consciousness, the power of spiritual will, and the reception of intuitive or revealed knowledge.
So it's not just about the fire, it's about the inner fire.
Yeah, the fire of awareness and transformation.
And the concept of freedom is revisited here not just as the static truth, but as the true activity of things, the dynamic divine order that adds another layer to its significance.
This expanded understanding of rhythm connects it to those active governing principles of the cosmos and the inherent truth that underlies all existence and action. It's not just a philosophical concept, it's a living dynamic force.
It's like the principle that keeps the universe in motion.
Yeah, exactly.
And the sacrifice itself, in this view, becomes a symbolic inner journey towards Truth, light, and spiritual fulfillment, rather than just a physical offering to the gods.
This interpretation elevates the ritual from a mere external act to an internal process of psychological and spiritual transformation and ascent. It's about sacrificing our limitations and our ego.
It's about inner purification.
Exactly.
Even the figures in the Vedic myths are reinterpreted. The Angirisas aren't just human sacrificers. They represent different forms of divine power described as sons of Agni.
This symbolic understanding sees the Angirisas as representing those various facets of the divine will and consciousness at work within the individual seeker, like different aspects of our higher self.
And Indra, the powerful lord of Swar, described as this luminous world of truth, is connected to these Angirisas, like a whole symbolic framework.
Indra's association with the Angirisas highlights his role in bringing the light of higher truth to humanity through the activation of these inner divine capacities, He's like the guide who helps us access those powers within.
And even the Panis, representing the powers of darkness and Vritra, this obstructing force they take on these symbolic meanings in contrast to those seeking spiritual illumination.
They represent those inner obstacles, the forces of ignorance, negativity, and inertia that hinder the emergence of truth and enlightenment within us.
So not just external forces, they're internal challenges we all face.
Yeah, exactly.
And those cows that are mentioned so often in the Vedas, they symbolize illuminations of knowledge, not just literal livestock that really shifts the meaning of those hymns.
This is a crucial insight in this alternative interpretation. The cows represent those rays of divine knowledge and insight that are sought after and won in the Vedic narratives. It's like those aha moments of spiritual understanding.
So they're not just herding cattle, they're herding wisdom.
Exact.
Saraswati, the divine word, embodies the stream of inspiration flowing from the truth consciousness. It all seems so interconnected in this symbolic reading.
Saraswati, in this context, represents the power of divine communication and that flow of wisdom that originates from those highest levels of awareness.
And Soma, that mysterious and sacred drink, can symbolize Ananda, the pure delight of existence. It's like the ancient texts are encoding this whole language of inner experience.
Soma, in this symbolic understanding, represents that ecstatic and blissful aspect of the divine experience, the joy that arises from union with that ultimate reality within.
It's like a taste of enlightenment.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Even deities like Varuna, Mitra, and Aryaman are given these deeper symbolic interpretations, going beyond their roles as nature gods. Varuna as the master of vastness and divine truth, Mitra as this principle of harmony, Aryaman as the aspiration for divine perfection. It's a complete reimagining.
This perspective reveals the Veda as this profound text of inner psychology and spiritual symbolism, offering a roadmap towards self-realization through understanding these internal dynamics.
And Agni then becomes this truth-conscious will, essential for the sacrifice of our own inner transformation.
Agni in this interpretation is that driving force of our inner spiritual aspiration, the will guided by divine wisdom that fuels our journey towards truth and purification.
Wow, that's an incredibly rich and layered understanding that emerges from your sources. So to bring it all together, the material you shared, it paints this picture of Hinduism with these incredibly deep roots, with those early connections to Iranian traditions before developing its own unique character shaped by India's distinct environment and history. The Vedas, particularly the Rig Veda, offer our earliest glimpse into this tradition, starting as collections of sacrificial hymns that evolved in terms of their ritual and theological complexity. And we explore the significance of nature worship and that foundational concept of orta, which paved the way for those more abstract monotheistic ideas that then flourished in the Upanishads, focusing on inner salvation, the relationship between Atman and Brahman, and that cyclical view of existence. And then adding this whole other fascinating layer, we delved into the possibility of a deeper psychological and spiritual interpretation of the Vedas, where the gods, the rituals, and those natural elements become these powerful symbols of inner realities and the path towards liberation.
What's particularly striking is how these different layers of understanding can coexist and enrich each other, The Vedas can be seen as functioning on multiple levels, as historical records of those early religious practices, as poetic expressions of wonder at the cosmos, and as these profound symbolic guides to the inner spiritual landscape.
Absolutely. Really gives you this deep appreciation for the enduring power and complexity of these ancient texts and the tradition they underpin. It's clearly far more than just a historical subject. It's this vibrant, evolving body of thought that has profoundly shaped and continues to influence a huge portion of humanity.
And connecting this back to your initial desire for knowledge that's both quick and comprehensive, what becomes clear is that these ancient texts, even in the forms they've reached us, are not simple or easily exhausted. They offer this ongoing source of inquiry and diverse perspectives on these fundamental questions about existence, reality, and our place in the universe.
Yeah.
So thinking about these different layers of interpretation, we've explored what might that concept of radam, that cosmic order and truth, but also the true activity of things, mean for your understanding of the world today. Or considering the Upanishads' emphasis on the inner self and the interconnectedness of all things, how might that perspective challenge or enrich your own views on life and existence? It really makes you consider how these ancient explorations continue to resonate with our modern search for meaning and understanding.
You know, it's a journey that's still unfolding.
Yeah, and the invitation is there for all of us to join in.